Hi, everyone. And for those of you listening to this on Hanukkah, as this is being released on the seventh day of Hanukkah, Freilich and Hanukkah, just wanted to jump on here before the episode for a quick couple of updates. I was hoping to get really a second or even first. Last week's episode on Yossi Pon was a little related to Hanukkah, wasn't specifically on Hanukkah, so I was hoping to get a more Hanukkah-related episode. Didn't get to it this year, unfortunately. Again, for those still listening, there's the previous episodes from last year with Professor Malka Simkovich and 2 years ago with Professor Lawrence Schiffman. That being said, this is a really good episode, I think, so I hope all enjoy. A couple of podcast updates. I'm working on 2 different series right now for the podcast. We'll see how they're released and things like that, but for those interested in learning more or sponsorship opportunities for the series or for general podcasts, if anyone wants to support the podcast in any way or to sponsor an episode, I'll put a link to PayPal through the website, and as well as please email me for other ways, Zelle or anything else, svarimchatter@gmail.com. Also, listeners have given me feedback, which I always appreciate getting, so please continue to email me, svarimchatter@gmail.com. And as well as if anyone can rate and review it, especially on Apple Podcasts. A lot of listeners have recently. I appreciate that. You can subscribe, but also rate and review it on Apple. And also, finally, check out the website, svarimchatter.com. Also about commenting, I believe you can comment on posts there. I don't know if anyone wants to, but you can check it out. I should mention that there is a blog post somebody posted, wasn't written by me, written by someone else, a blog post about a review on Sefer Maccabees 1. There was put out a Hebrew kind of critical edition. I mentioned this, I think on last year, 2 years ago's podcast with Professor Simkovich or Professor Schiffman. So that is on the website, farmchatter.com. And as well as I'll mention that if anyone wants to do anything, release anything, post anything, any blog posts, should email me, farmchatter@gmail.com. Reach out. I'd like to expand the blog even more. You can check out what's already there, just kind of short reviews or a little bit longer of Sfarim or books, things that are interesting. So email me if anyone is interested in that. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Sfarim Chatter podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined by Professor Jessica Marglin, who is Associate Professor of Religion, History, and Law, and the Ruth Ziegler Early Career Chair in Jewish Studies at the University of Southern California. And we'll be discussing her new book titled The Shamama Case, Contesting Citizenship Across the Modern Mediterranean, published by Princeton University Press, about a very interesting case and dispute over Nissim Shamama's fortune. So thank you, Professor Marglin, for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really great to be in conversation.
Okay, let's start off. Tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and your background.
Yeah, well, I live in Los Angeles. I teach at USC. I've been there since 2014. I have been interested in the history of Jews in North Africa and the broader Mediterranean since I was an undergraduate. I owe a lot of my interest to my original mentor when I was an undergrad, Professor Susan Miller, who's now Emerita from UC Davis. And I kind of fell into legal history when I started my dissertation at Princeton. I got really interested in law as a way to kind of get a different view of the history of Jews in North Africa, and also particularly how they were interacting with non-Jews, mainly Muslims, not only Muslims, but mainly Muslims. And this book really stems from my interest in both of those things, my interest in law and my interest in Jews in North Africa.
So is that how you became interested in the case? I mean, how did the case come to you? It's kind of, it's funny. I was telling you before we started recording, I actually hadn't heard of the case, but when I posted about it on Twitter, people told me, oh, they know of the case. They know it from the Child Chuvas, as we'll get into. They knew of the case. So is this something you knew of? You decided to get those two interests?
I definitely I didn't come across it like in my very broad. I would love to say that I just am so familiar with teshuvot from the Mediterranean, the 19th century, but that's not how I came across it. It was very much kind of stumbling, though. Like I was actually working on a totally different article about a rabbi, also legal history, about a rabbi who was similarly a very controversial figure who kind of lived between Algeria and Morocco. And he did a lot of his publishing in Livorno with the famous rabbi who's known not so much as a publisher, but as a philosopher, Kabbalist, Eliyahu Benamozegh, whom I mentioned a little bit in this book. And Eliyahu Benamozegh, wrote all of these philosophical works, but he also wrote a couple books about the Nissim Shamama case. And when I saw that, I was like, that doesn't seem to fit with what I know about Eliyahu Benamozegh, who is thought of as this philosopher Kabbalist. And so I was curious. I was like, what are these other books that Eliyahu Benamozegh is writing? I just wanted to know more about him as a person, as a publisher. In general, I kind of knew that Livorno was a node for connecting North African Jews to not just, the Italian peninsula, but actually the broader Mediterranean. So my curiosity was piqued. So I kind of went down the rabbit hole a little bit, trying to figure out what those books were about. And then I realized there are like lots of teshuvot about the Nissim Shamama case, and also other writings in Italian and French. I owe in some ways my early kind of stumbling into the case to the work of a very wonderful scholar, known as Robert Attal in French, or Avraham Attal in Hebrew. He publishes Avraham in Hebrew. He was the director of the Yad Ben Tzvi Library. And he wrote these bibliographies of Jews in North Africa. And he had a kind of side interest in the Nissim Shamama case. He actually published one very, very short, almost like an article basically about Nissim Shamama. And he, in one of his bibliographies on Jews in North Africa, he had a kind of index to Nissim Shamama, and he signaled all of the different publications, including teshuvot and legal briefs, essentially in Italian and French. And so that was my first kind of inkling that, wow, this isn't just one book by Eliyahu, or this isn't just two books by Eliyahu Benamozegh. This is a bigger thing. And so, I just started to read about it. And eventually I'd read enough that I thought, wow, I should see what's in the archives in Tunisia. And once I went to Tunis and I went to the archives, and I realized that there were literally thousands and thousands of documents about this single case, I kind of decided that, okay, this is more than just a rabbit hole or a footnote or even its own article. This is a whole book.
Okay, so that's how we ended up with the book. All right, so let's start off. We mentioned Nissim Shamama, and we'll get to him, I guess, the main figure in the case. But I do want to start off that he was from Tunisia, and you said this is North Africa. So, but let's tell the listeners who may not be familiar. Where is Tunisia geographically? What is its history as a country at this time? Let's start off like that.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So Tunisia is it's a little sliver between Algeria. Algeria is to the west, Libya is to the east. And it's actually pretty close to Italy across the Mediterranean. It was from the 16th century, what is usually described as a semi-autonomous province of the Ottoman Empire, meaning that it was part of the Ottoman Empire, but especially from the 17th century, it basically had its own dynasty of rulers. They were known as beys, and they were like, de jure, they were Ottoman governors, right? They were technically appointed by the Sultan, but in fact, there was a hereditary dynasty, and they essentially ran things themselves. So the Ottoman government was important and the Ottoman Sultan was important, but most of the time as a kind of like figurehead and a kind of potential sovereign that you could appeal to if things weren't going well in Tunisia. The Jewish community in Tunisia is old, as all of the Jewish communities are in North Africa. There's exactly when they get there. The legend has it that they get there at least around the destruction of the Second Temple. Archaeological evidence is a little bit later, but you do have a lot of archaeological evidence from the Roman period, synagogues, gravestones, things like that. Starting in the 17th century, particularly, you get an influx of Sephardic Jews who come from Livorno, actually. So again, Livorno is this very important sort of node. And then from then on, there's a kind of a bifurcation of the Jewish community into what are called the Twansa which are which basically means Tunisian in the local dialect of Arabic, so the Tunisian Jews, and the Grana, which essentially means Livornese in the Tunisian dialect of Arabic. And these two communities, I mean, they coexist, but they have separate shochatim, separate batidin, separate even cemeteries, and certainly separate kind of administrative structures. So that's kind of the situation that Nissim Shamama is born into. Now, you might ask, well, was Nissim Shamama Twansa or Grana? And that is actually one of the questions at the heart of the case, because most people kind of assume that he's Twansa, but at some point he claims to be Grana. And, again, it's one of these things that, will we ever know exactly? Probably not.
Okay, so we'll get more to that. So just a little more, you said that they're called the Beys. The Bey of Tunis was the leaders. So basically, Edwin, just how did it work? Talk about them a little bit and how, so the Ottoman Empire, the Sultan in Istanbul is kind of in charge, but it's kind of the Bey is really like kind of a king. Like, how does that work?
Yeah. Basically, like the Bey is the one he's in charge of tax collection. He's in charge of, he has his own military. He even has his own foreign diplomatic relations with foreign powers. So he signs his own treaties, say, with European powers. So it really is largely autonomous. But, if he does something that the Sultan doesn't like, that could get him in trouble. And sometimes the Sultan asks him to do things. Certainly he offers tribute to the Sultan. Every time there's a new Bey, the new Bey has to get a kind of formal approval from the Sultan. Every time there's a new Sultan, the Bey has to send a kind of delegation. So there's a lot of back and forth. The relationship actually gets strained in the 19th century between the Sultan and the Beys of Tunis, in part because the Beys get a little bit nervous about the Sultans because the Sublime Porte, which is the name for the government in Istanbul, actually sort of takes over Libya, which is a semi-autonomous province that had previously run just like Tunis. And the Ottoman Sultan basically decides that no, Libya should be essentially an integral part of the Ottoman Empire with, an Ottoman governor and not its own dynasty. And the Tunisian Beys are a little worried about that, right? They see that as a threat. And then, of course, there's the threat from the other side, from the French, who have just colonized Algeria in 1830. So in the period, like right when the book kind of starts, the relationship of the Bey to the Sultans is starting to get a little bit testy.
Yeah, I realized I didn't really say this. We're going to be firmly in the 19th century, a lot of the 19th century here in the book. So, and also just to clarify, the country is Tunisia, but Tunis is the capital.
That's right. Absolutely. Yeah. Tunis is the capital city, has the largest Jewish community. There are Jews in other cities, and even in small towns. The other maybe very important community is on the island of Djerba, which actually still has the largest community in Tunisia today. But Tunis is, by far, it's the administrative capital. It's where the seat of government is. It's where most of the Jews are. It's where the merchants are. It's where the foreigners are. It's definitely the big metropolis.
Okay, one last general thing is you mentioned Livorno, and there's going to be a lot more Livorno discussion in the podcast, but for those more interested in Livorno, I did a podcast episode with Professor Francesca Trivelato dedicated to discussing Livorno, so that's on the podcast a while back. You can check that out if you want to hear all about Livorno and the Jews of Livorno. Okay, so let's talk about, we already teased him, alluded to him, Nissim Shamama.
Yes.
It's a fabulously rich, unknown person to a lot of people, I'm sure. So let's talk about him, his biography, his upbringing, and his gradual position and how he got all his money.
Right. So he doesn't start out fabulously rich, but he's not dirt poor either, right? He comes from what would probably be described as a middle class or upper middle class family. He has ancestors who are rabbis, and even, his father posthumously has a book published. He himself does not go into the rabbinate. From what I can glean from his personality, that was definitely not his bag. He was into power, and pretty young. He's born in 1805. And by already the sort of 1830s, 1840s, he's already starting to make himself kind of indispensable initially as a tax collector, which was a position that not only Jews held, but that a number of Jews had held already before him. He was really the first of the Shamamas to become central in the government. And he also kind of opened up paths for other family members, both in his immediate family and as an extended family, to enter government service. He starts out basically, sort of with these sort of smaller responsibilities, and he gains more and more trust, he gets more and more power, and along the way he makes more and more money, because the way tax collecting works in Tunisia, as in many parts of the Middle East at this period, is that it's basically tax farms, which means, let's say you have the region of Tunis, right? So if you want to collect taxes for the region of Tunis, you have to pay the government upfront a large sum of money, and that gives you the right to collect the taxes. And the idea is that you recuperate your losses by taking just a little bit more than whatever it is you owe the government, right? And if you hit the sweet spot, you get enough of a surplus to make yourself rich, but not so much that you impoverish everybody and, ruin the province, right? So that's the sweet spot for tax collectors, for tax farmers. And, Nissim Shamama proves himself very good at this stuff, right? He proves himself really quite successful, and he gets kind of more and more responsibility until basically by the 1850s, he's kind of like number one in what could be called the Ministry of Finance. His patron, a guy named Mustafa Khaznadar, is prime minister. So he's the Bey's number two man. And Nissim Shamama is sort of Khaznadar's number two, right? So he's very, very powerful. He kind of clearly spends a lot of time. Tunis is a funny city. Tunis has a sort of walled, kind of equivalent to the old city in Jerusalem, like a walled city that's sort of the heart of the city, with the most important mosque and things like that. Then it has all of these sort of outlying cities on the coast, really more like villages, including the port city of La Goulette. And then on the other side, on the inland side, is essentially the government sort of almost like complex. And it's a sprawling palace that also has like a military complex. And that's where the Bey and his advisors hang out. So Nissim Shamama, by the sort of early 1860s, certainly is spending a huge amount of time in the Bardo. It's called the Bardo, this palace thing. Now it's a museum. You might have heard of it. Tragically, there was a terrorist attack there a while ago. But that's sort of, and it's not a place where there are a lot of Jews, but Nissim Shamama is not the only Jew. There are a few other sort of Jewish figures, including his own family members, who sort of rise to these very high positions and are kind of in these orbits. But he is by far not just the most powerful Jew in the Tunisian government, but really one of the most powerful figures in the Tunisian government in this period of the 1850s and early 1860s.
Okay, and you said so. I think you explained well what he does, how he made his money through tax farming, but he invests in other things, right? He ends up branching out. He's not only making his money just from taxes.
That's right. It's not just taxes. He starts out as a tax farmer. He ends up buying the monopoly to trade certain items like wax and certain kinds of raw materials. And that allows him to also make more money. And, he's sort of like the one who is, he's not the only one trading them, but he is the one who is charging all of the customs for those international trade routes. He also buys the right to the taxes on the customs house, which essentially means that like all customs that don't have like a specific monopoly, like olive oil has its own kind of thing, but all other goods that are coming in and out of Tunis that have to pay general customs duties, he's in charge of that. So he also gets a slice of that. And then eventually he does what, other rich people in really everywhere at this point, not just Europe, are doing, which is he buys stocks and bonds, right? He invests in all sorts of things. And it's not clear to me if he does that while he's still in Tunis or after he leaves. We haven't got to that yet. But at some point, he kind of diversifies his portfolio, essentially. And he invests in railroads. He invests in municipal bonds. He invests in steamships. I mean, he's just all sorts of things. And he invests enormous amount. This is the other thing. He's as a kind of, basically like the Minister of Finance, he's very central to the process by which Tunisia starts to borrow money at the state level, right? So this is something that today is completely normalized. Pretty much every country in the world has a national debt, and it's not weird, right? And it's kind of, it's like just part of the way finance works. But in the 19th century, this was kind of just getting going. And a lot of banks were actually still reticent to lend to non-European countries. On the one hand, they charged much more interest, so they can make a lot more money. On the other hand, the risks were higher. Tunisia wanted to develop their country. They wanted to modernize. They wanted to, install telegraphs and streetlights and new aqueducts and improve their army and eventually get railroads, telegraphs, all the things that other countries were doing at this time, modernizing. But they really just didn't have enough money, and so they borrowed. And at first, this seemed like a good idea. Nissim Shamama was sort of involved in some way. It's not totally clear, but clearly in some way in getting that very first loan. And then the loan was a public loan. So anybody could buy shares of it, right, on the international bond market, essentially. And he bought a lot of bonds in the Tunisian loan. This didn't turn out to be the most profitable thing that he did because Tunisia eventually went bankrupt, but nonetheless, he had a fair amount of money also invested in Tunisian national debt, essentially.
So I want to bring something out here that reading the book, you didn't get to this till a fair bit later, but I think it's important to point out to the listeners here how rich he was. I know we're at one point later, but in the book you get this later when we'll get to his death and everything. But I'll give that away. Spoiler alert, but. Really how rich he was. I mean, people probably don't realize this person they probably never heard of, this North African Jew. I mean, how rich was he?
So he, it's hard to say because it's like when you start saying, we know that his fortune when he died was worth 27 million francs. But that doesn't really tell you much because what does that mean to have 27 billion francs in 1873? And it's very hard to just convert it to a dollar number today because things cost different amounts and you can't just say, oh, well, this is worth this amount today. But I think the best way to think about it is to think about like how he appears in the sort of distribution of wealth of the richest people in Europe at the time. And economists, including Thomas Piketty, who many people have heard about his book Capital, it was a very unusual bestseller for an economic history book. He did a wonderful study, co-authored with some other economic historians, who basically showed that the top, not just 1%, but 0.1%, had fortunes on average that were well under 27 million francs. I don't remember the exact numbers, but something on the order of like 5 or 6 million francs. So in other words, Nissim Shamama was in higher than the 0.1% of people in Europe at this time, meaning he was one of the very richest. When you look at like people who were very, very rich who died around the same time, you see that, the names that we know, like the Rothschilds, were richer than Nissim Shamama, right? Like the Rothschild that died around the same time as him in the 1860s. His fortune, I think, if I remember correctly, was something in like the 60 million franc region. So that's more than 27 million for sure. But not like that much more, right? I mean, so Nissim Shamama was up there with that really wealthy elite, many of whom we've heard of, the Rothschilds, the Comondos, the Ferrucis. I don't know if you've read The Hair with the Amber Eyes, or seen the exhibit at the New York Jewish Museum. But anyway, some of these other names are more well known, largely because they managed to retain their fortune generation after generation, whereas Nissim Shamama, the fortune just dissipated after him, right? So he was forgotten and his fortune was forgotten.
Yeah, so I just wanted to, we'll get more to that. I just wanted to point out how rich he was, and he was fabulously rich. This is a very rich person that we're talking about. And, again, spoiler alert, there's going to be a massive fight over this fortune when he dies in 1873. Okay, so now, as you mentioned, though, let's talk about him leaving Tunisia, leaving Tunis. The government gets in this financial trouble. They start borrowing money. He's involved. What exactly
Yeah.
happens that he has to leave? Where does he go?
Why exactly he leaves is not totally clear. And part of it is that there are kind of different narratives. The first thing that happens is in 1864 in the spring, basically a civil war. There's a sort of tribal leader who revolts against the raising of taxes, which is done in large part to pay off these international loans that Tunisia is taking out. And of course, Nissim Shamama, presumably he doesn't make the decision to raise the taxes himself, but he's the Minister of Finance. He's the head of tax collecting for the entire country. It's easy to blame him. Plus, he's Jewish, and there is, a kind of history of blaming whatever the minority is, right, including Jews. So he clearly is worried about his future. Whether he's just worried and decides that the best path is to leave, or if there are kind of like literally sort of rebels beating down his door, threatening to kill him, and he's literally kind of running out the back way, that's not clear, right? He himself gave two different versions. Like in one version, he's clearly running for his life, and in another version, he's like, oh yeah, no, I just asked the Bey if I could go to Paris and help him get a new loan in Paris, and so I left, right? But he leaves in a bit of a hurry in 1864, and he goes, via first to Livorno actually, but it's just a pit stop, and then to Marseille where he has some family, and then to Paris. And in Paris, he kind of sets up shop. First, he rents this, giant apartment, and then he rents yet another apartment. And the thing that's important to say that we haven't mentioned so far is that Nissim's personal life has been the opposite of his professional life. Professionally and, financially, he's had wild success. Personally, it's been kind of a disaster. He basically can't have any children. He marries a first wife, no children. He marries a second wife at the same time because polygamy is totally acceptable among Tunisian Jews at this time. Still no children. His first wife dies. He marries a third wife, right, at the same time. So he has the second and third wife at the same time. And somehow he has a falling out with the second wife, I think, because she doesn't come with him when he leaves. The third wife comes with him. She's much younger, as far as I can tell. Her name is Esther. And by this time, he's probably surmised that the reproductive problem is not that of his wives, but his. And he basically adopts his great niece, a woman named Aziza, who is the daughter of his nephew, a guy named Shlomo or Momo. His nickname is Momo. And at first, Nissim and Momo are relatively close. Later on, they'll have a falling out. But Aziza essentially kind of grows up in Nissim's house. And Nissim basically helps her get married. And she has a kid in the midst of this civil war in 1864, literally days before Nissim decides that they have to pack up and get on a boat and leave. And she and her husband and her 4-day-old son leave with him. Now, it's important what she names the son, because normally Sephardim, right, name the kid after the paternal grandfather, but she doesn't do that. She names the son Nissim after her great uncle, who is essentially like her grandfather. She's essentially kind of made him into her grandfather, or even really more of a father figure. So Nissim goes to Paris, and he brings Aziza, her husband Moshe, and their son Nissim, whom I call Nissim Jr., just for because it's too ambiguous. Otherwise, it's too hard to tell which Nissim you're talking about. Nobody called him Nissim Jr. as far as I know. And they all moved to Paris, and they kind of settle in. And Nissim Shamama Sr. is really involved in trying to get a new loan for the Tunisian government. He sort of surrounds himself with other Tunisians and other people kind of working for the Bey, but it doesn't work. And there's some kind of falling out. It's not totally clear. There's a lot of correspondence, but the correspondence is very kind of polite. And at some point he falls out with his former patron, Mustafa Khatnadar. And at that point, he clearly is kind of there's something of a break, right? I think there was a long time where he thought, oh, maybe I'd go back to Tunisia, maybe I'd go back to Tunis, things will calm down, I can go back to working for the Bay, I could go back to my life. And there's a point at which he kind of realizes, that's not going to happen. That's not in the cards for me anymore.
Right. Okay. So then he's in Paris. Just talk a little bit. But one other person that we didn't mention because he plays a part throughout the book. I don't know how much. There's other characters in the book. I will say there's a real cast of characters here. We're not going to get to all of them, and some of them only briefly in the book. They're discussed much more in depth. But there's this banker, the Erlanger, I think the banker. Maybe you want to talk about the banker because what he does to Tunisia and his role. We should mention him.
Sure. Absolutely. Yeah. So the banker Derlanger or Derlanger in French, he's of Jewish origin. He's from one of these Frankfurt Jewish banking families, but his father actually converted already to Christianity. So he was born and raised Christian, but as was often the case in 19th century Europe, that didn't matter. And he was still perceived as a Jew, especially when people were attacking him. In any case, he moved to Paris. He set up a branch of the family business in Paris. And he was kind of a shady character. Like his first big break actually was financing the Confederacy, the United States Confederacy. He floated them these important loans when they were kind of struggling. Needless to say, he was a good banker because even though the Confederacy lost, he made away with lots and lots of money. He ended up actually marrying a daughter of the Confederate ambassador, a Confederate senator. Anyway, he was the one who gave Tunisia its first international loan. And then he gave a second international loan. And when Nissim got to Paris, he's clearly looking around for lots of different possibilities for loan. But it seems from the correspondence that I read, he's corresponding mainly with his patron, Mustafa Khaznadar, and also with some other officials back in Paris. It seems pretty clear that Tunisia, the financial standing of Tunisia is bad enough that nobody wants to loan them money, right? Nobody wants to take a risk on Tunisia. The only guy willing to take this risk is Derlanger, the shady banker that has already kind of gotten Tunisia into the financial trouble that it's in some ways. So Nissim sort of tries to negotiate a new loan with Derlanger. In the end, they do sign a loan with Derlanger, but it's not through Nissim. It's through other people, again, because he has this falling out with his patron. And Derlanger is, sort of central to the story at this point, just because of his role in financing Tunisian loans and eventually kind of leading the way for bankruptcy. Because, of course, Derlanger is a banker and he wants to make money for the bank, for himself, right? He's not really that concerned about helping Tunisia. I mean, he's happy to help Tunisia if it'll make money for himself, but ultimately he's going to look out for himself. So the loans are pretty, the terms are pretty bad. And of course, Tunisia is desperate enough that they'll sign anything at this point.
Right. I think in the book you said 12% interest or something. What are they?
Yeah. Really, it's quite extortionate.
Much high. Yeah, really high. Okay, so going back to Nissim. So Nissim's in France. He buys a house in France. You said he was in an apartment. He ended up buying something, then he moves to Italy. Decides he's going to Italy. Why does he decide to pick up? He's going back.
Right. Well, maybe I should say before he goes to Italy, he actually seems to have no intention to go to Italy. He seems to really like Paris. He buys a house. He buys an identical house next door for Aziza and her little family. He's a rich guy, so he could just buy 2 townhouses. I mean, it's like the equivalent of going to the Upper West Side of New York and buying 2 gorgeous townhouses, right next to each other. He also is starting to think about the legal trouble that he might get into were he ever to be called back to Tunisia. And that's when he starts to look into the question of citizenship. He first thinks, I'm living in Paris. Why don't I try to get French citizenship? But for reasons that I could never figure out, there's no trace in the archives, that doesn't work out. He's not able to get French citizenship. My hunch is that basically to become a French citizen at this time, there are 2 things you can do. Either you can live in France for 10 years, after which it's very easy, right? Then it's just an application, no problem. Or if you want to fast track it, you need some serious connections. You need basically an act of parliament to give you citizenship. And presumably Nissim just didn't have those connections. So his next idea is, why did I write to the King of Italy? I'll write to him and I'll say, first of all, I would love to make a donation to the Kingdom of Italy of 50,000 lira, which is a large sum of money. And wouldn't it be nice if you made me a count? And first of all, this is something that lots of people all over Europe, including Jews, are starting to do. They're starting to essentially buy titles of nobility, especially from kind of, places like Italy, Portugal are more willing to kind of give out this create this sort of new aristocracy. So first he becomes a count. And then once he's a count, there's a whole negotiation over his coat of arms, which is very funny because he first wants a coat of arms that's like super Jewish. It's like Moshe with the tablets on Mount Sinai. And the heraldic official in Italy is basically like, no way, this is not going to fly, way too Jewish. And he suggests something that does have Hebrew on it that says, Ani Adonai Elokecha. But it otherwise looks just kind of like a more kind of sanitized, regular coat of arms. And then after he gets the coat of arms and he becomes a count, he writes again, he says, I would also love to be a naturalized Italian citizen. And in this letter, he says, my ancestors are Livornese, and I would like to kind of return to my ancestral citizenship. Again, presumably he doesn't elaborate this in the letter, but presumably he's sort of making a claim to belonging to that community of Grana Jews, of Livornese Jews in Tunisia. And he sort of banks that nobody's going to look into it too much. And indeed they don't. And the king sends back a royal decree saying, absolutely, go ahead, you could become an Italian citizen. At this point, what I think is pretty clear is that Nissim Shamama thinks, okay, I'm an Italian citizen, right? That's all I needed to do. Fine, this is good. And it's no problem to live in France as an Italian citizen, because lots of people do that, right? Especially this super elite. A lot of these elite, especially Jews, but not only Jews, don't ever get citizenship of the place they live in. The Afrusis don't have French citizenship for many, many generations. The Camondos, who's famous Ottoman family, actually end up with Italian citizenship, not French citizenship. So he's, this is the norm in his milieu. Nobody blinks an eye. But then there's another kind of upheaval. Fall of 1870, there's a war between France and Prussia. There's a siege of Paris. Finally, the Parisians managed to push the Prussians back. And then in the spring, so first that's very bad. He actually sends Aziza and her little family down to the south of France where it's safe to be with relatives. And they communicate via carrier pigeon, which was the only way to get messages in and out of Paris. And we actually have records of these messages. It's quite amazing. They don't say much interesting, just like everybody's okay, don't worry. But nonetheless, we know that they were actually sending each other messages via carrier pigeon. So then things calm down, Paris is safe. And then in the spring, this is kind of like the straw that breaks the camel's back. The Paris Commune erupts, right? This kind of socialist working class uprising against the wealthy, which is, puts Paris again kind of into a war zone and is specifically targeting super wealthy people like Nissim Shamama. And it's at this point that Nissim is like, that's it, I got to get out of here. And he decides to leave. He decides to move to Italy. He moves the whole family. He keeps his place in Paris, but he moves the whole family to Livorno. And that's where he settles. And he doesn't live there for very long. He lives there for about a year and a half. And then suddenly, one morning in January, Friday morning, he dies. He wakes up. He has a terrible pain in his intestines. A couple hours later, he's dead.
Okay, so let's leave it there before we get to the next real part of the story. I just have a couple things to comment. So first of all, you said the Kingdom of Italy founded in 1861 or so, so it's founded around there. So he's able to pay them off. It's a new kingdom where he's going to pay off. Now, You mentioned he was going to have these legal troubles in Tunisia. He wants to become another citizen. So there's really two things we have to discuss there. What does it mean to be a citizen at this time? There's no passports. You can't get into the country without a passport. I mean, this is discussed in the book, but just for listeners, that is not what a citizen means. It doesn't mean what... Yeah. It didn't mean then what it means today. So I think we should clarify this. And that goes hand in hand with how's it going to help him to be an Italian citizen to get out of his legal troubles, right? If he's going to get in legal trouble, how's that going to help?
That's a great question. His main legal trouble is his former patron, before he becomes friendly with Mustafa Khaznadar, was a guy named Mahmoud Ben Ayad, who himself absconded from Tunisia to Paris, actually also bought a lot of property in Paris, became a French citizen, and then ended up suing Nissim Shamama, claiming that Nissim Shamama owed him huge amounts of money. this was a kind of ongoing lawsuit the whole time that Nissim was in Paris. And Nissim's fear was that Mahmoud ben Ayed would force Nissim to show up in a court in Tunis, suing him as a Tunisian subject, as a subject of the Bey of Tunis. In which case, not only would he have to go to Tunis, but he then might sort of, be in trouble going back to Tunis, a place that he'd left rather hastily. He was no longer on good terms with the prime minister. It seems clear that he really didn't want to ever be sued in Tunis. And if he was an Italian citizen or a French citizen, then he could insist that whatever lawsuit takes place would happen in France or Italy, especially if he was living there, right? So that's kind of the motivation behind his search, I think. I mean, again, this is all my reading through the lines because he never kind of explains it, but this is my sort of hypothesis based on all of the archival material that I read. Citizenship, I mean, it doesn't mean what it means today, especially in the sense that, yes, borders were largely open and people did get visas, but it was easy to get a visa. And in fact, a passport functioned more like a visa does today. So you wouldn't get a passport unless you wanted to travel to a particular place. And that would basically, like if you wanted to get an Italian passport, it would be to travel to Italy, not necessarily because you were Italian. So you might go to an Italian consul. In fact, this is what Nissim does. He goes to an Italian consul in Paris and says, I would like a passport to travel to Italy. That passport is not, it does say that he's an Italian subject, but it is not in itself proof of his Italian citizenship. But people, what's interesting about citizenship is that, at this time in particular, most people live much of their lives, if not their whole life, without necessarily ever knowing their citizenship, right? Unless they are drafted for the military, or unless they move across a border and then face some kind of legal trouble, either when they want to get married, or then if they die, or if their parents die, right? If they just stay in place and nobody comes to draft them for the military, they're paying local taxes anyway. So the kind of national state tends to be rather at a remove. And this is in part why I think Nissim Shamama, he was thinking about his citizenship, but he also wasn't, like, you might say, dotting all of his I's and crossing all of his T's. And as we'll see a little bit later about that. So he probably thought, yeah, okay, I did it. I got Italian citizenship. I'm good. But he wasn't sort of thinking very carefully about who would maybe eventually question his citizenship and whether the Italian government agreed that he had citizenship, right? Because most of the time, citizenship didn't matter that much.
So, I mean, may as well mention here what happened. So, unfortunately, he doesn't, put it into effect. It's not promulgated. It's like he just leaves it. And
exactly.
What is a massive issue in the case. This is literally the issue of the lawsuit.
Yes. So, right, he gets this royal decree from the Italian king. And then the decree says you need to register this with an Italian official and declare a vow of loyalty to the Kingdom of Italy, right? Ideally, he's also supposed to establish residency in Italy within 6 months. All of this is supposed to be within 6 months of the decree. And he does none of these things. He stays in Paris for another 5 years, actually. He doesn't register the decree with the local Italian consulate, and he takes no vow, right? Again, for a long time, I was like, why? Why doesn't he do this? And I really have become convinced that it's not that he didn't do it on purpose. It's more that he really didn't think it was that important. He thought, okay, I have the decree. Register it. It's fine. I have it. I don't need to register it. And again, it was the norm in these elite circles that you would get a foreign citizenship and you wouldn't necessarily move there. So he probably also thought all these other wealthy individuals living in Paris have all of these foreign citizenships. And here they are in Paris. So fine, I'll stay in Paris too, right? Just like them.
Okay, so now fast forward, we're in Livorno, 1873, he dies right away. So he dies, he doesn't have any, there's no kids.
Still no kids.
Yeah, right? So this is a problem at this time. What happens now? But they discover a will. But let's
exactly. Right. So basically, as soon as he dies, there's sort of immense suspense because nobody knows what he wanted. Nobody even knows for sure if he made a will. The police come And they're like, well, is there a will? And everybody's like, I have no idea. I don't know. One of his servants, by this time, he has a kind of little, almost like retinue of Tunisians, including a few Tunisian rabbis, some of whom he describes as his secretaries, who kind of have come and live with him in his compound in Livorno. And one of them says, yeah, I think he made a will. I think he made a will back in Paris. So they, there's one of the teshuvot that is published shortly after his death. It includes this very almost kind of literary rendering of his life and death, which is all done in allegory. So it's not with names. It's all done with like pseudonyms. But it has this description of the police going into the chamber where his dead body is lying and prying the key to his office out of his bosom. And they take it and they open his office. And sure enough, they find 4 identical copies of a will on his desk. So this is like a big deal. And first, they don't read it right away. There has to be like an official reading. There's a whole legal procedure. First, there's the funeral, because of course, for Jews, it's very important. So as he dies on a Friday, he doesn't get buried on Shabbat, he gets buried on Sunday morning. And it's a big deal, right? It's like lots of dignitaries, carriages, enormous numbers of people. It's a whole to-do. Shortly after the funeral, there's the public reading of the will. And he writes it in Judeo-Arabic, which is, as far as we know, the only language in which he was literate. So just in case, I imagine not everybody on the podcast knows what Judeo-Arabic is. Basically, Judeo-Arabic is a little bit like Yiddish. It's a dialect of Arabic, but written in Hebrew letters, just like Yiddish can be considered a dialect of German, but written in Hebrew letters. And like Yiddish, it has, a lot of Hebrew words in it, right? A lot of sort of particular expressions. Judeo-Arabic is much closer, certainly Tunisian Judeo-Arabic is much closer to the Tunisian dialect of Arabic spoken by non-Jews than Yiddish was to German, certainly by the 19th century. So this was true of Nissim Shamama, it was true of all Jews in Tunisia. Their spoken Arabic was completely comprehensible, but very few Jews were literate in the Arabic alphabet. So they couldn't read or write in Arabic. They were literate in Hebrew because educated Jews learn Hebrew then as now. And so Judeo-Arabic was the kind of way in which they wrote. Now, Nissim Shamama was wealthy and he had a lot of correspondence with good government officials. So actually, most of the correspondence that we have that survives from him is in Arabic, but it was written by his secretaries, right? He probably dictated it and then they wrote it down and kind of translated it into a more literary style. But this will he wrote by himself, no witnesses, nobody else signed it. There were no notaries. It was just him in his office. And it says that he wrote it in Paris in 1868 when he was still living, actually not even in the house that he bought later, but in an apartment. He gives the address. And in the will, he says that he gives half of his fortune to Aziza and her son Nissim Jr., right? 1/4 to Aziza, 1/4 to Nissim Jr., and then 1/4 to one of his nephews, Joseph, and the last 1/4 to his great nephew, Nathan. Joseph and Nathan are still in Tunis. And this is in some ways, it's a bombshell. In some ways, it's not. Aziza and Moshe, and, by this time, little Nissim is, 9 years old. So he's probably not all that involved or aware, but certainly Aziza and Moshe were hoping that Nissim had given them something, right? They'd been living with him, living off of his largesse, clearly kind of designated as his heirs, really for almost Aziz's whole life. But first of all, the bombshell is that Nissim disinherits his nephew, Momo, who is Aziza's biological father, who also is one of the 3 closest male relatives, right? So the other thing is that Jewish law, halacha, has a sort of pattern of devolution that is laid out in the Torah and then extrapolated on by the rabbis, which says very clearly that when somebody dies and they have no children, their wealth should go to the closest male relatives. So in Nissim's case, this was clearly Joseph and Nathan, both of whom got a 1/4 in the will. and Momo, who gets almost nothing in the will. He gets like 25,000 francs. It's like almost insulting how little he gets. So Momo presumably has known that he is one of the three closest male relatives to his fabulously wealthy uncle Nissim, knows that Nissim has no biological children, and has presumably been waiting for a long time to inherit all of this money. And so the bombshell is he might not get it, right? Because the will gives nothing to him and a huge amount to Aziza and Nissim Jr. But I think I say this at some point in the book, right? The only thing that we can sure about in life is death and taxes. But when somebody dies very wealthy, the other thing that we could be sure about is that there will be some kind of fight over the estate, right? And of course, with an estate this complicated, there is a very kind of clear fight that starts really almost even before the will has been read, and that is the heart of the lawsuit. That's the heart of the legal case. That's really central to the book, which is essentially, is Nissim Shamama's will valid or not?
Okay, so first of all, Momo, the nephew, I think you say in the book, he had taken out like credit on Nissim's name, so kind of was taking out credit cards in his name. So there was bad blood there. But also another part is Momo owes the Tunisian government money, so he needs the money to pay back. So it's kind of he needs his money, and of course he just wants the money in general, so it's kind of a mess. Now you talk about the will. So you say he wrote this will, there was no witnesses, so that's the holographic will. And now when that comes down to it, is that valid or not? And this is becoming this is a halachic question. This is a legal question. Which law gets applied?
Exactly.
Okay, so what's kind of lay out the legal and halachic questions? What's going on with this will?
Right. Okay. So there's the first question really in some ways is, where is this all going to be adjudicated? And that everybody agrees about. It's going to be adjudicated in Italy, because before he dies, Nissim declares his domicile in Italy. So whether or not he actually was an Italian citizen, everybody agrees that he's domiciled in Italy. He owns property in Italy. The Italian courts are going to adjudicate the estate.
Explain what domiciled means.
Oh, right. Sorry. His legal residence is in Italy. Yeah, his legal residence is in Italy, and that's like still a thing today, actually, like where people's legal residence is. Actually, even in complicated inheritance questions, that can still be sort of factor, right? Is somebody legally residing in the United States, right? It matters whether you reside in California or New Jersey, sometimes, because sometimes inheritance law can be slightly different. Anyway, so similarly, but that's not up for grabs, right? Everybody agrees Italian courts have jurisdiction. What quickly becomes clear they don't agree on is which law the Italian courts are going to apply. And this is because of the following. Italian law, the Italian Civil Code, lays out that if an Italian dies in Italy, then, of course, Italian law applies to their estate. But if a foreigner dies, then their, quote, national law applies to their estate. So if a Tunisian dies in Italy, then Tunisian law applies to their estate. A Tunisian Jew, like Nissim Shamama, in Tunisia is under halacha for what we today call personal status, right? What is often kind of known as family law. So inheritance is something that is adjudicated entirely by halacha in Tunisia. So it quickly becomes clear that if Nissim Shamama did not become Italian citizen, did not die Italian, then Italian law would not adjudicate his estate. And actually, the whole question of whether the will was valid would be up to halacha. It also became pretty clear that, first of all, Italian law would almost certainly validate the will. No question, right? There was a little bit of question in the beginning, but the lawyers looked into it, definitely kosher according to Italian law. But it became very also similarly clear from the beginning that according to halacha, there was much more of a question of whether this was a kosher will. And that has to do with a number of issues, which essentially, comes down to simplify a little bit, the rules for making a will basically before you are on your deathbed, right? If you're on your deathbed, then a lot of the rules go out the window and the rabbis are kind of much more lenient, and basically almost whatever you do is okay. But if you're not on your deathbed, and it's very clear that Nissim wasn't, he made the will at 1868. He doesn't die until 5 years later. He actually says in the will, I'm healthy, I'm doing fine. And so in that case, according to, again, this is Shulchan Aruch, I mean, it's pretty standard. If a healthy person, a bari, makes a will, they need to devolve the property at that time. They need to enact a kinyan, which is a ritual act of acquisition that has legal weight according to Jewish law. And even though the property doesn't entirely go to the person that's going to inherit, right? There's a kind of funny division well, it's not funny, but it sounds kind of old-fashioned. There's a division in Jewish law between the guf, the actual property itself, and the perot, the usufruct of the property, basically the right to use it. So the property itself gets transferred to the person that you want to inherit, but you retain the use of it until you die. And in order to do that transfer, you have to do a kinyan. No sign of a kinyan anywhere in the will. None of the language that the rabbis kind of lay out for how you give money to people who wouldn't be the inheritors according to biblical law, essentially according to Leviticus. So on its face, it seems pretty likely that this will is not going to pass muster before rabbinic law.
Yeah, this case is really for those lawyers or law students. It's like civil procedure. This is like Erie doctrine, Erie railroad. What are we doing? Which choice of law is applying here? This is like when I was reading this book, I was like, oh boy. So that's kind of what's going on over here. So now, but you say that halachically it's a problem, but first of all, there's a number of things. Let's get that. There's a number of things that happen here. So obviously there's Aziza, and also the second wife who is still alive in Tunisia. She sends a representative. She gets a lot of money, so she wants this to be valid. She teams up with Aziza and the others. So at that point, also in the will, I believe he left a fair bit of tzedakah to different communities in Eretz Yisrael. So they stand there. There's a couple things going on. So now they do go and they are proactive, and they want to make sure if it is going to be Tunisian law, so then it's going to be halacha. So they go and they get a tshuva. They write a shaila to Rav Ashkenazi, who talk about him. He's the Chacham Bashi. He's this Rishon LeZion, and he writes a tshuva or a kuntris. He actually talks about validating the will, even with these halachic issues.
Right. So, Jewish law is like any law, and any good lawyer, like any good rabbi, can make a pretty convincing argument anyway for almost anything. Not anything, but almost anything. So even this will that really on the face of it seems like, wow, this is not a halachic will. Ashkenazi is the first person to write a tshuva on the case. And he says, no, it is halachic. And he has all these different arguments, some of which have to do with basically, respecting the wishes of the dead, and these were clearly the wishes of Nissim Shamama. Some of it has to do with essentially the custom of Jews in places like Italy and France, and that halacha should follow custom. And the custom of Jews in places like Italy and France is to write wills that are not like kosher wills, that are like, basically that look like French wills, right? That look like the kind of notarial documents that a Christian notary would produce. And he also makes all these kind of like exceptions where he says, yeah, okay, so he doesn't use exactly the right legal formula, but he uses these other words that you could imagine him to mean the legal formula. So let's just imagine that he does mean to say the thing that he's supposed to say. He's basically, making a case for why this could be a will according to halacha. Pretty soon after, he publishes, first of all, he writes the tshuva, he then sends it out as people do. He gets all of these haskabot from rabbis all over the place in North Africa and France, in other parts of the Ottoman Empire. Eventually, he sends another round for haskamot. He has kind of like the second edition, and he gets even more letters of support, some of which are published in French, interestingly, in the kuntris, even though, of course, he writes in Hebrew. But then, of course, other rabbis disagree. And there are other, pretty much right away, one from Tunisia, one from Salonika, a city that's today Thessaloniki in Greece, but at the time was also part of the Ottoman Empire. And they say that's ridiculous. This Ashkenazi is just wrong. This is clearly not a kosher will for X, Y, and Z reason. Basically, for what I said, it doesn't have a kinyan, it doesn't devolve the property in the proper way, it doesn't use the right formulas, et cetera, et cetera. And this begins like a pretty big halachic legal battle where you have rabbis in Tunisia, in Italy too. You have a few rabbis in Italy who also weigh in, mainly in Livorno. And this becomes basically like almost a parallel story to the story that is happening in the Italian courts, because the Italian courts first need to figure out what law to apply before they can worry about what halacha says. And the rabbinic discussion almost happens of its own accord, right? Because rabbis get interested in legal cases, and kind of like scholars, if somebody says something that you disagree with, you want to publish the rebuttal, right? You want to prove them wrong. So there's something of a kind of like, it becomes something of a cause célèbre, I think, among rabbis really around the Mediterranean.
So the lower court in Livorno goes a different way with its ruling. So talk about that ruling and then the appeals process, and they kind of both sides hire really famous lawyers.
Yes, exactly. So everybody knows this is going to go through various rounds of appeal, just like any big case in the United States. It's not going to end from after the first trial. The first trial is adjudicated by the lower court in Livorno, and they say actually he died neither Tunisian nor Italian. He actually was stateless. He renounced his Tunisian citizenship, but he never formally became an Italian, so he was stateless. And then they say, well, stateless people are clearly under Italian law for matters of inheritance, so Italian law applies to the state, the will is valid, etc. And it's at this point that both sides, and basically the leaders of the sides at this point, are Aziza and her family, who are trying to prove that he died Italian, or at least that the will was valid under Jewish law, right? The other side is led by, on the one hand, Momo, Aziza's estranged father and the estranged nephew of Nissim Shamama. And Momo is now kind of working with the Tunisian government. The Tunisian government has essentially decided that Nissim Shamama owes them a lot of money. The best way to get money back from the estate is to get Momo to inherit the amount that he was supposed to inherit and then give them a big chunk of the money. So they send a guy, a man named Hossein ibn Abdallah, who himself is a fascinating figure. And now both sides, Hossein sort of is the lead on the government side, and Aziza is the lead on her side. And they hire these uber famous lawyers, the two most famous lawyers of international law in Italy. Aziza hires the most famous, a guy named Pasquale Stanislao Moncini, who really is one of the fathers of international law as we know it today. He is the first president of the Institut du Droit International, the Institute of International Law, which happens to be founded in 1873, the same year that Nissim died. And the other side hires his son-in-law, Augusto Pirantoni, who was a student of Mancini, who fell in love with Mancini's daughter, who is normally a business partner of Mancini. They work together on cases, but in this instance, as far as I know, the only instance, they're on opposite sides of the case. And they're both basically, Mancini is trying to prove that Nissim died Italian, and Pierantoni is trying to prove that he died Tunisian.
So interestingly, from Mancini takes kind of an interesting approach. Usually, if you were arguing you're on appeal, you're going to argue, if you're the winning side, uphold the lower court's ruling. For those, lawyers, that's what you would do. You wouldn't go and say, no, you know what, even though I won on the lower court, forget about, the other side's arguing against that. Now I'm going to argue also against it for my own thing. Kind of a really unique approach here by this lawyer. And he's going to try to argue, like you said, that he's Italian. The other side argue Tunisian. So kind of, if you want to just in brief, I mean, these are in the book, you go through this much more in depth. A lot of this stuff, especially this, we're not going to go super in depth here. If you're interested, read the book. There'll be a link in the show's notes. It is a really, really interesting read, a fascinating book. You really get a lot in here. But just in brief, talk about a little bit, just very briefly, both sides, kind of what they were arguing, each side.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I'll start with your point, which is exactly, as I say in the book, that, you would think that Mancini would say, okay, the lower court already ruled that the will is valid. Look, he's stateless. Let's just go with that. And let's, basically support that opinion. But he has his own agenda, and his agenda is partly about helping to define what it means to be Italian. And I'll just, you said this, you mentioned this, but it's worth remembering that Italy is a brand new state, right? You could say that it kind of starts in 1848 with the beginning of the Risorgimento, but there isn't much going on state-wise until 59, maybe, then 61. Really, in some ways, it's not until 1871 when the Papal States fall, Rome becomes the capital. Now Italy is really, a state. Now they have a civil code, they have a government, but there's still a lot of kinks to work out, right? And exactly what Italian citizenship looks like is unclear. And so I think Mancini, he takes this case because he's a practicing lawyer and he needs to make money, but I think he also takes it in part because it's something of a test case for him. It's something of a test case of, just how far can we push the limits of who is Italian? And his main argument is Nissim Shamama was descended from Livornese Jews and thus was an Italian citizen, not even by virtue of the royal decree from the king, but actually by right, because citizenship flows through blood, right? He has this almost kind of racialized idea of what Italian citizenship is. And he's a really good liberal, and he wants Jews to be part of the Italian nation. He's very anti-clerical. He doesn't like the church. He doesn't like the right-wingers who are kind of worried about letting Jews be full citizens. So this is also, I think, something of a kind of, he cares about the idea that Jews should be full citizens. On the other side, Pierantoni, in some ways, totally shares Mancini's politics. He's also a liberal. He also is anti-clerical. If anything, he's even more anti-clerical. He might have written the only book on international law ever to be put on the banned books list by the papacy. You got to imagine that it was like he was really quite incendiary if the papacy bothered to ban a book on international law. And he's really, on the one hand, he really sees eye to eye with Mancini. But on this case, he sees Mancini as being almost too idealistic. Mancini is very enthralled by natural law. He thinks of certain things as inherent rights that are universal across the earth, across the globe. And Pierantoni is basically like, look, some countries have rules that maybe we disagree with here in Italy, but that's their law and we have to respect it. So his main argument is that Tunisia does not allow somebody to give up their citizenship, right? They don't allow somebody to say, I don't want to be a Tunisian citizen. And therefore, Nissim Shamama never got, explicit permission from the Bey to give up his Tunisian nationality. So Nissim Shamama remained a Tunisian national and could not actually have become an Italian.
Okay, and there actually develops another line of thought, right? I think it's at this time, before this, after this ruling, I think, is that Nissim was neither nor stateless. He was Jewish. Jewish is his nationality. And there's another character you can mention him together, El Malik, if I want to pronounce his name. So
yeah,
this is a different argument. I want to mention this argument.
Yeah, so this is in some ways the kookiest argument that comes up in the case. It's kooky, okay, I say that a little bit tongue-in-cheek. At the time, I don't think it sounded kooky at all. Actually, I think it sounded pretty serious, even if not everybody agreed with it. Today, it sounds kooky because we think of nationality as inherently tied to a state, right? We think of nationality as about the state that you belong to. But in the 19th century, first of all, still today, the word nationality can mean different things. It can mean sort of legal nationality, like your citizenship, essentially a synonym for citizenship, or it can mean nationality in the sort of ethnocultural sense, like Jewish nationality, right? Or, Greek nationality or Italian nationality. And in the 19th century, there was an enormous amount of sort of fluidity between these two things. And nationalism was still fairly new. And the idea that every nation would have a nation state was still not kind of the accepted reality. So there was this character whom we haven't mentioned yet, but again, right, we're not going to get to all of the characters, but he is really an interesting guy. His name was Eliyahu al-Maliach in Hebrew, or Elia al-Milik in Italian and in French. And he was actually born in Algeria, so he was a French citizen, moved to Tunisia, where he made his career. And he kind of, basically like came to the Tunisian government, in particular to this guy, Hussein, and said, look, I can help you out on this case. I know Arabic and French and Italian and Hebrew and Judeo-Arabic. You don't know the Hebrew, the Judeo-Arabic. How are you going to navigate Jewish law? I know the Jewish community. I can help you get what you need to prove the case. And so they hire him essentially as a kind of like fixer. But he is an ambitious guy and he starts writing his own legal briefs for the case, which he publishes in Hebrew, French, and Italian. It's not clear which language he writes them in first. I tend to think Hebrew, but I can't prove that. And he's the one who most strongly comes out in favor of this idea that Jewish law must apply to the estate, because regardless of whether Nissim was Italian or Tunisian, the Italian civil code actually says that it has to apply his national law. And as a Jew, Jewish law must be his national law. And it's going to follow him wherever he goes, no matter what. And Jewish law is a national law, just like Italian law is a national law, just like French law is a national law. And it's interesting. Mancini is quite upset by this argument, in part because obviously he's arguing the opposite side. He's arguing that Italian law should apply, but also in part because it really troubles his category of nationality and the centrality that he gives to nationality, because it sort of basically says, like, here are these Jews, they really don't fit into this idea of nationalism as you've described it, because they really seem to be their own nationality, and yet here they are in Italy becoming Italian nationals, right? So how does that work? And Pierre Antoni is sort of like silent on the issue, but he's working with another Italian lawyer who has a totally different political persuasion, who is much more right-wing, who is friendly to the church and friendly to religious people in general. And he sort of says, yeah, actually, that makes sense. Jews are their own nationality. They have their own national law. That is a good reason why halacha should apply to this estate. In the end, the judges reject this, right? Basically, they're like, this is no, a national law means a nation state. There has to be a state attached. Jews don't have a state. So that is not an argument for applying halacha.
Right. And exactly. So, but at the same time, as people familiar from, with when these inheritance kind of things drag through court, when anything drags through court, money's being spent on lawyers, money's being spent on legal fees, and just the money's being spent. And, some of these people, Aziza and the others, we didn't even really get into Joseph and Nathan. They're also there. You have their whole story in the book. There's a lot more in the book, even more to the argument and everything. But anyway, they're all there. They're all used to living rich. I think you say, like in Livorno, they call it, you're like acting or living like a Shamama or something. And so they're used to living with a lot of money. They need money. They're running low on money because they don't have access to the inheritance. So they start signing away the money. I mean, what happens then while we're in the middle of this court case going through the court system?
Right. So it really does. I mean, one of the reasons I wanted to write this book also is that it feels like one of these Victorian novels. There are so many kind of subplots and they're all sort of going at the same time. So at the same time that all of these high-powered lawyers are busy coming up with their arguments, right, the potential heirs are sitting around in Livorno paying these lawyers, paying for their fancy lifestyles, and they're running out of cash. And whom do they turn to basically give them an advance on their inheritance? But Derlanger, the original banker based in Paris, who got Tunisia its first international loan and who essentially got Tunisia into the trouble that it was in. Why Derlanger cares about this is not totally clear to me. On the one hand, he probably just saw it as another way to make money. He could buy up all of the shares of the inheritance and basically by giving people an advance, he could end up making money. But I think also there was something of a sort of a little bit getting back at Nissim Shamama, right? Whom he, I think, parted with not on particularly great terms. So he ends up basically going around secretly to all of the heirs. And in the end, Derlanger is the kind of shadow man behind both sides of the case, because finally, really shortly before the case finally ends, he signs an agreement with the Tunisian government itself to say, we'll just split the proceeds of the case. Tunisian government gets 28%, Derlanger gets 72%, then the Tunisian government will get back whatever money it thought it was owed by Nissim Shamama, and we'll call it quits. And yes, I mean, there is a lot more kind of to all of this, but it is ultimately the this is a bit of a spoiler alert, but ultimately it's one of these tragic situations where really the only people who come out rich are the lawyers and the bankers, and the heirs themselves, they get something, but it's very little. And the Shamama family, this is part of why the story is not well remembered, except by a few people who are quite familiar with halacha and realize that there are a whole bunch of teshuvot from this period on the case. Other than that, it's really largely forgotten because the Shamama family essentially just becomes destitute, kind of disappears, and there's nobody to really carry on the legacy that Nissim Shamama starts.
Yeah, like I said, the story is really like a Victorian novel, and I mean, reading the book, it's just really fascinating. So you have a lot of Tunisian history, and there's a lot of these legal arguments in here, and then there's all these subplots and all the plots going on with the people involved, the cast of characters. So we get the court ruling, so we can say the court ruling, and then the lawyers go out, and then we're going to get Rav Eliyahu Benamozegh is going to hop in. We're going to have more people getting involved in the case before it goes to the next level up.
Yeah, basically, okay, so right, the last kind of two sets of characters that I just think are totally fascinating, and this is sort of the very end of the legal plot in some ways. Basically, there's the Court of Appeal, the kind of mid-level Court of Appeal, that rules in the same way as the Livornese court, that goes to yet another Court of Appeal, and the highest level court essentially says, first, there's a court of cassation, which we don't have that in the American system, but it's in the French system as well, and the Italian system. Basically, once you get an appeals court, the next court essentially decides, did the appeals court do it the right way, or does it need to be reappealed? The cassation court says, no, the appeals court misruled, right? They didn't do it. They didn't rule correctly. It needs to be reappealed. And at this point, it becomes pretty clear from the ruling of the Court of Cassation that the judges are sympathetic to the idea that Nissim Shamama died a Tunisian citizen, which means that halacha will be important in the case. And suddenly everybody's scrambling to make sure that they have a good halachic argument on both sides for, on the one hand, why the will should be upheld according to halacha, and on the other hand, why the will should be thrown out according to halacha. And of course, this is also its own kind of subplot in terms of Jewish history, which is the idea that non-Jewish courts have to decide what is proper according to Jewish law. This is not the first time that this happens, right? This is something that you see even in early modern Central Europe, right, in the Holy Roman Empire. I haven't yet found enough good studies on how halacha shows up in non-Jewish courts. That would be a fascinating topic. If any of the listeners are looking for a good dissertation topic in Jewish legal history, like this is really screaming for some attention. There's a little bit of precedent, like in the French colonial cases, because you have Algerian Jews who before 1870 are under Jewish law, and French courts sometimes have to basically decide what does Jewish law say about a case. But there's no real handbook for this, right? Like, who gets to say what Jewish law is? And one of the things that both sides realize is that they need Italian Jews to make the case in Italian in a way that will be legible to these Italian judges. So Aziza, at her side, hires Eliyahu Benamozegh, who I mentioned him at the very beginning of the podcast. He is a publisher, a famous rabbi already, a kind of weird combination of mystic and rationalist, like a philosopher and a Kabbalist. He also, he knows Judeo-Arabic. He himself is partly Moroccan in origin, although he was born and raised in Livorno. And he writes also kind of a wacky defense of why, according to halacha, the will should be upheld, which his book is about 300 pages long. 250 of those pages is a kind of long discourse on essentially Dina de Malchuta Dina, right? He's essentially saying the law of the state is the law, and Jews have to follow the law. And then at the very end, he kind of rehearses some, like in the last 50 pages, he has a more kind of halachic approach where he rehearses Ashkenazi's teshuva, some of the points from Ashkenazi's teshuva. And he's pretty, you'd think that he would be very influential because he is the kind of preeminent rabbi in Livorno at the time. He has something of an international profile. On the other side, the Tunisian government hires a somewhat unlikely person, not a rabbi, but rather a professor of Jewish studies, who is one of the earliest professor of Jewish studies at an Italian university, who specializes in rabbinics, who is not a halachist, right? But who knows all of the rabbinic sources, who actually was Benamozegh's student, a guy named David Castelli, who writes this kind of very like a much more traditional interpretation of Jewish law that is, to anybody who's familiar with Jewish law, just sounds a lot more kind of standard and halachic than Benamozegh, who like goes off on these long kind of philosophical rants. And in the end, the final court, which is the Court of Appeals in Florence, that's the court that has the last word. In the end, the court does, as expected, rule that Nissim Shamama died a Tunisian. And then they say, okay, now what does Jewish law say? And interestingly, they essentially ignore Benamozegh. They kind of disagree with Castelli, and they end up going with a legal brief written by two Jewish lawyers, but lawyers who were not trained in halacha, who kind of wrote basically like an Italian version of Ashkenazi's Teshuvah. And that becomes the thing that the Italian court finally paraphrases. And, the ruling is fascinating because it's this sort of 10-page ruling, 7 pages of which are this long excursus on what is halacha, what are the sources of halacha, what does the Shulchan Aruch say about wills, and how does it fit with this particular will, and what is the wording, and can it be interpreted in the light of this particular section of the Shulchan Aruch, and what does Maimonides say, and et cetera, et cetera. I mean, it's totally fascinating. And, as is the case with every book, with this book, I really felt like there were so many other directions in which I could deepen the discussion. And particularly, I feel like there could be absolutely a whole book just about the halachic debates and how they play out. And, that's something that definitely there's still more to say, as I said, also to historicize, like, how do European courts deal with halacha? It's so interesting to see this Italian judge try to make head or tails of like what rabbinic sources say about inheritance and what is a kosher will.
Okay, so that's kind of like the end. Now, like I said, there's a lot more. You go a lot more. I really want to emphasize that into the cast of characters in the book. So then you kind of get into the afterlives of a lot of people, and we're not going to get into El Maliach, El Milik, and Joseph. There was the one that we were going to discuss here, Hussein and Ibn Ayyad. See the book for that. That's all stuff we couldn't get to in this podcast episode. But we should just mention, like you mentioned right before, the heirs don't really kind of win here at the end. But what does happen to Aziza and her family and Nissim Jr., as you call him down? Like, what ends up happening to kind of the Shamama family after?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll say there's the only character that kind of does okay is Nissim Jr. He shockingly becomes a lawyer. But he doesn't do it in Italy. He actually moves to France and he makes his career there. And he specializes in, you guessed it, wills. He writes his dissertation on inheritance in Roman law. And he has a really successful career. And he's sort of interesting because he's sort of obsessed with citizenship his whole life. Like, he's really interested in this idea of dual nationality, which today we think of as totally common, right? Especially, so many Jews have Israeli citizenship and American citizenship, say, but in the 19th and early 20th century, it was very uncommon and largely frowned upon, right? You really couldn't, the idea that somebody would want to be citizens of two places at once was really bizarre. And Nissim Jr. basically was trying to make a case for why that actually could be a good thing, right? Why maybe states should allow that. But unfortunately, many of the other descendants of Joseph in particular, and of Momo, both of whom ended up staying in Europe. Joseph ended up staying in Livorno. Momo actually left. He came to Livorno, then he went to Corfu. Finally, he went to Montpellier in the south of France, died there. But his descendants largely stayed in France. And they are a great example of how nationality for Jews becomes often deadly in the theater of World War II. because if you have the wrong nationality, that often means deportation or execution. So, the sort of most extreme are that we know of, I couldn't trace all of the descendants, but that we know of, is one of Momo's sons, who remains a Tunisian national, doesn't seem to ever get French nationality, and gets deported from France to Auschwitz and is killed in 1944 with his wife. This, I mean, if you know anything about the story of Jews in France during the Holocaust, right? Many Jews with French nationality died, but the vast majority of Jews who were deported and killed were foreign Jews, right? They were the ones who were absolutely the first to be deported, the first to be murdered. And Italy is a little bit similar. Not as many foreign Jews in Italy were deported, but similarly, the son of Joseph, who was born in Livorno but never managed to get Italian citizenship, during the war suddenly is a foreigner, right? And a Tunisian and thus French, because by this point France has colonized Tunisia, and he gets put into a detention camp. He doesn't die; he makes it through the war, but the letters that he wrote to the Ministry of the Interior are preserved in the archives, and they are, I mean, incredibly depressing and moving. I mean, he literally says that he's sick and cold and shivering, and he doesn't have enough to eat, and he's an old man. He's in his 60s by that point, and his son tries to get him out and fails. His daughter tries to get out and fails, and he finally gets out and dies very shortly after the war, almost certainly from kind of exposure. So this is the kind of fights over citizenship that happened to Shamama in the 19th century, right, over his estate, during World War II and under Nazis and their allies, become truly a matter of life and death.
Yeah, and that's why it's a really interesting, even if that part is sad, book. I mean, throughout a lot of different angles. Are there any Shamamas around today?
There are a number of people who are related to the Shamama family. I could not find any direct descendants. Obviously, Nissim didn't have any direct descendants, but I could not find myself any direct descendants of Nissim Jr. or of Joseph or of Momo. I think they're out there, but interestingly, like the people that I managed to speak to who were related to Nissim Shamama were often kind of very distantly related, and it wasn't always clear how exactly, what part of the family tree. But Jews in Tunisia are ashamed of Nissim Shamama, right? He doesn't have a great reputation, and he's not an ancestor that Tunisian Jews tend to be proud of. It's sort of it's a complicated legacy. And so I think there's a way in which, I imagine after I published my first book, which in some ways was also kind of centered around a certain family, a lot of family members came out of the woodwork after the book came out. So I'm sort of hopeful that some Shamamas will contact me once this book is out in the world. And who knows, maybe I'll have to write like a follow-up if I learn anything particularly interesting. But it doesn't surprise me that, the Shamama legacy hasn't been kind of publicized by the family, because it does have that kind of shameful association.
Right. And that association is not necessarily because of the case. It's also because of there were accusations against.
That's right. Right. And that, I think we might have said this before we started recording, but it's not totally clear whether he really did steal money from the Tunisian treasury or not. What became clear to me is that the accusations that he did actually came more from French colonial officials than they did from the Tunisian government, and originally were lobbied by this one French character who really had it out for not so much Nissim Shamama, but Mustafa Khaznadar, his patron. And then later there was this anonymous French pamphlet that was just virulently anti-Semitic, that really singled him out as the culprit in the demise of the Tunisian state. And that kind of legacy of anti-Semitism has continued well into the 20th century, because the main book about this period in Tunisian history is written by a French historian who's now passed, Jean Gagnage, but it remains kind of the essential, reading for anybody interested in Tunisian history. And it is unbelievably anti-Semitic, right? I mean, it's not just about Nissim, but basically about all the Jews who show up in that book. And it's interesting. Like, I think there's a way in which sort of North Africa in particular, any anti-Semitism that is there is assumed to be something between Jews and Muslims. But in fact, the French colonial presence had an enormous effect of kind of bringing anti-Semitism to North Africa in ways that we're still trying to understand today.
Okay, so if anyone found this, interesting, there's a lot more in the book, like I said a bunch of times, but I want to just reiterate, there really is. As much as we got to hear, there's like so much more in the book. So I'll put a link in the show's notes that people can purchase it. I think you said maybe you have like a code that I can put there from Princeton.
Yeah, I have a discount
if anybody
code.
wants. Yeah, and as it is, Princeton is very, very affordable. So I'll put a link in the show's notes and people can purchase it. And thank you very much for joining.
Oh, thank you so much. This has been so much fun. Really appreciate it. It's been great.
Thank you.